Okay, hi. So this lecture, we're just going to cover part two of the overall lecture on origins and diversity of Apis mellifera in Ireland. And for this section, I'm just going to look at Ireland's honeybees. So where Ireland's bees came from and what do we have here in Ireland. So firstly, I just want to touch on the fact that we have two types of bees in Ireland. We're very lucky in having that, in that we have our managed bee cohort, but we also have a free living or wild honeybee cohort. And like I said in the last lecture, well, honeybees were at first a wild species, and then Ireland beekeepers have managed those bees and exploit them to their own devices or uses and needs. But both of these populations are actually belong to the same population. So as I said before, we haven't fully domesticated the honeybee. We don't control its breeding for the most part, and we don't also control its foraging for the most part. And therefore, the bees that are living in the wild often are freely mating with the managed cohort, so they're the same population. My work started around 2014, and when I started working on bees in Ireland, there was a lot of information on the grey literature, i.e. in magazines and books and the internet, saying really that there were no native bees in Ireland and no wild bees either. And really, I couldn't find very much evidence of this, hard evidence of this. And so that kind of got me curious. And part of my introduction into beekeeping in Ireland was really to try and provide scientific evidence to support beekeepers. And in 2012, the Native Irish Honeybee Society was established in order to try and protect and conserve native Irish bees. And so we did have a group of beekeepers, maybe between 400 and 500 members of that organization that kept black bees. And there was a bit of aggro, I guess, in terms of whether these were black bees or they were all hybridized. What's the point of protecting black bees when they don't really exist? And some beekeepers were also, I suppose, criticized for maybe inbreeding black bees and the issues that this causes. And so in terms of, say, some of the historical documents and stuff, for sure in the 1920s, there was a massive population crash of bees, and the IBA committee described letters reporting about Ireland being fairly cleared of bees. And also Brother Adam at that time in the UK, in Buckfast Abbey, was known to have stated that native bees in the UK were completely wiped out by the Isle of Wight disease, and it was assumed that this also happened in Ireland. And Norman Carrick has done a lot of work on the history of bees, native bees in Ireland and England, and he is subsequently really, he and others that he worked with have shown that Brother Adam was not quite right. So native bees were not wiped out. They had a population crash for sure, but they still existed. And of course, this was the birth of Buckfast bee, because Brother Adam went about designing a strain of bee that would be more resilient to the Isle of Wight disease. It was also discovered really that it wasn't just acarine or the Isle of Wight disease that caused the demise of bees, but there were multiple factors, including even the effects of World War I. In terms of there being no wild colonies left because of Roa, this has also been used as a reason really for not including honeybees in the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, for example, and also for people to import bees and not really think about them as a wild species anymore. And this is true in many places in Europe as well. So the IUCN Red List for honeybees is data deficient because in 2014, the review group didn't have any information about wild bees anywhere in Europe. There was a publication in 2010 by Jaff et al. That were using genotyping, looking at populations, and they suggested that wild bees did exist in Ireland because there wasn't the genetic diversity of the managed bees did not fully explain the amount of diversity that must be present. And so they hypothesized the presence of wild bees. And it's important because, as the quote here is saying, there are no wild or native colonies left because of Rowan hybridization by the NPWS officials. So this is the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And these really, I suppose, in my mind, are the government agency responsible for our biodiversity, in particular, any native species that were present in Ireland, particularly if they're threatened or endangered, and whatever distinct subspecies or varieties that we have in Ireland. But two things matter here. One is, if honeybees are described as domesticated animals, then they're not the remit of NPWS, they're the remit of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. But if we have wild, truly wild honeybees in Ireland that are native, and of a subspecies that are threatened with extinction over much of its range, then in my view, it's very much the remit of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And also, if we accept that honeybees are never fully domesticated, but then they're not necessarily completely the remit of the Department of Agriculture either. So I do think both of these government agencies need to be involved in our management strategy for this subspecies in Ireland. And we also have statements like the Native Irish Buckfast that are misleading, especially to beginners, because it's incorrect. Buckfast are not native to Ireland. But this is what drew me into working on this topic. And so firstly, I obviously went and looked at kind of evidence and information around whether honeybees are native to Ireland or not. And again, Norman Carrick has done most of this work already. And so in terms of being native, it's assumed that honeybees are native to Britain and Ireland, that Apis mellifera mellifera is native to Ireland, and that honeybees arrived in Britain and Ireland through the land bridges that emerged after, in between the ice melting from the last ice age and before the water levels rose to separate Ireland and England completely from Europe. And so this figure on the left shows you the landmass that would have existed at different time points since the last ice age. So the green color represents landmass that would have been there 16,000 BC. The slightly darker green around here is the land masses that would have existed around 8,000 BC. And the dark green, represents landmass that would still have been there at 7,000 BC. And so that green landmass connects Britain and France. And then also in certain places here in Northern Ireland, you see that there's a spit of land connecting Ireland and the UK. And so the brown then is representing the land that is seen today. And of course, both Britain and Ireland are separated from Europe because of rise of sea levels. So in this context, it's thought that as the trees colonized, as the ice melted and trees started to recolonize Northern Europe, that insects, including honeybees, would have followed those plants and the trees as they colonized, and would have come into Britain and Ireland. So in this context, it's thought that honeybees would have colonized Ireland and England naturally. And this is one definition of something being native, is that if an organism can colonize an area and survive in that area under its own steam without having to be supported and managed by people. Now, there are some models that would suggest that there were no land bridges between England and Ireland at that time. And of course, we don't know, but there have been different sophisticated models being developed, and some of those would suggest that this never happened. However, it's also thought that the distance that would have been there, even if a land bridge itself didn't exist, so if there was some water here, that the distance between England and Ireland was so short that many insects colonized Ireland very naturally from England, and there's no reason to suspect that a honeybee wouldn't have done that too. The other way that bees have made it to Ireland from a long time ago was people bringing things to Ireland by boat. So even from the time of St. Patrick, so 500, 600 AD, there's lots of descriptions of bees being present in Ireland and being brought to Ireland by people by boat. And so those bees that were brought like in 500 and 600 AD and subsequently have been here for, again, over 1,000 years, and so have also colonized and adapted and survived very naturally in Ireland from that time, and have been here for so long now that is another definition of native, that they have made their way into our language, into ancient art, ancient laws, and really embedded into the culture of Ireland. And that would be another definition of being native. So after that time, in much more recent times, bees have also been brought into Ireland by people, And so we have, at the time in around 1923, when Ireland was swept clean of bees, apparently there were a lot of overtures from beekeepers and the IBA at that time for the government to intervene, and the government arranged imports of lots and lots of Dutch bees in skeps from around 1923. And Micheál McGillicuddy remembers as a boy, for example, in Kerry, his uncle getting skeps of bees from the Netherlands. And so this is in our recent memory. And at that time as well, there were imports of other subspecies. So like Ligustica, reported from 1927. And then as Brother Adam in Buckfast developed his Buckfast bee, they were also brought into Ireland, as was Carnica. So we have these different stages of bees being brought to Ireland. And so from a time when it would have been only Apis mellifera mellifera, then from about 100 years ago, we start seeing the importation of other subspecies into Ireland. But it's clear then that Apis mellifera mellifera is the only subspecies that's native to Ireland, and it has been here for a long, long time. And because it's been here for a long time, it has adapted to the type of climate we have in Ireland. And one of the adaptations is that it's dark, like the rest of Northern European honeybees. And this is so that it can absorb heat in cool summers. So much more different than, say, Apis mellifera ligustica down in Italy, that's much brighter in color. It's also thought that it has adaptations to wing and flight muscles that help it to actually fly in these windier, wetter conditions. And this other next character might be arguable among some of you, and that this is that the native bee is actually docile. Now, any population is going to have variation, and not every bee is going to be very docile. I'm sure some pure native bees have some aggression in them as well, and they need aggression to be able to defend nests and so on. But the real aggression that, you know, bees chasing you out to the field and meeting you as you arrive and ready to sting straight away without any warning, and all of that is a different matter. And it's, you know, there is, I suppose, good biological sense to think that that is due to hybridization. So Apis mellifera mellifera is dark, so too is Carnica. And we do have Carnica in this country. And it is thought that the second generation of hybrid bees are more aggressive. And this is really by beekeeper observation. There hasn't been any scientific tests of this that I have seen, but it's fairly widely discussed amongst beekeepers that, you know, when you get hybridization, that the first year, the first generation of hybrids are really productive and prolific and lots of honey and, you know, building up the hives and the colonies really well and just doing really well. And then the second year, the second generation, that they're really, really aggressive. And I talked at the end of the last lecture about these genetic complexes and genotypes. And when you get hybridization happening between different genotypes, so where the genomes are quite different between those that are breeding, that you can start to see traits that are not really wanted. And also the hybrids, it's thought maybe they're not actually very compatible. And therefore, the other suggestion is that these hybrids might not actually live and get sustained for long periods of time because, and this is called outbreeding, when you get breeding between fairly genetically distinct organisms. So it's almost, it can be as bad as inbreeding, where you get breeding between close relatives. If things are too different and they're bred together, it can also cause problems because the adaptation has happened in different places and DNA divergences starts to accumulate. And if that DNA divergence gets too great, then the offspring can suffer. Basically, the hybrid offspring no longer really fit with either subspecies and may not fit the environment as well as either parent species. In a rare occasion, a hybrid can do even better. But it's thought anyway that that might be one reason for the apparent lack of docility in AMM when you get breeding between Carnica and mellifera, a second generation. You can have a dark bee that's aggressive, and that sometimes may be blamed as a native bee. I don't know, we haven't done any work on that yet, but that makes sense to me. Other characteristics of this which help it really, especially when summers aren't as good as we might like. And this is the colony size is fairly small, it's long-lived, has good honey production, and often the pollen is actually brought in around the brood nest, in around the honey, so that it's there when needed. Also has good propolis production, which is important for resistance for honeybee health. Frugal with their stores, so they'll also go off lay when forage availability declines, and so this is good for their survival, and so that they can survive better in poorer weather. And also there's some question as to whether they are resistant to disease, and this is something I guess we're looking at, and the fact that wild bees do exist in Ireland and are surviving in the face of Roa might mean that there was some adaptation or some variability in the population that allowed the native bees to be resistant. So just to look at this map for a second, to look at where the other subspecies of bees that might be found in Ireland have come from. So this is the paper, the link to where this map was published. And you see here the M lineage again in Northern Europe, which we showed in the last section. And this is the bee native to Ireland. And then just under this, below the Alps, basically south of this range, you have Ligustica and Carnica bees, which would be very commonly brought into Ireland. Buckfast bee is not a subspecies, it's a hybridized, I don't like the word mongrel, but this is, we don't really know what buckfast is anymore, but so it's not a defined subspecies. So these two, Carnica and Ligusta, are probably the two main ones brought into Ireland, but we do get wind of other subspecies being brought in small numbers to Ireland as well. So that means that in Ireland we have, as well as Apis mellifera mellifera, we have Apis mellifera carnica here in Ireland, and we also have Ligustica. And then probably more common than these would be buckfast. There would be a fair amount of buckfast here, and some people, I think, are breeding buckfast in Ireland. So there are numbers of other bees that are brought into Ireland, probably in small numbers. Approximately 115 queens are imported each year legally, although I heard that this year that imports are high. But we also know that many are brought in illegally, and so this is of concern. In terms of how many of these kind of non-native bees are in Ireland, we don't know. I guess there has been a fair amount of animosity over the years in terms of people being chastised for having non-native bees and so on, but people are perfectly legally entitled to import bees into Ireland at the moment. If we look at get any indication from the Facebook pages, we see that the Irish Buckfast and Carnolian Beekeepers Facebook page has about 237 members, whereas the general Irish beekeeping Facebook page has over 5,000. Now, of course, Buckfast and Carnolian Beekeepers are probably also members of the Irish beekeeping Facebook page and so on, but so there's a large number of beekeepers who aren't members of Buckfast and Carnolian Beekeepers. So that might hint that there are much, much lower numbers of beekeepers keeping these bees than native bees. This here is I have raised because just some of the inaccuracies that are going around here. This website really annoys me because it's welcome to the native Irish Buckfast queens, and this is really not honest and not true. So Buckfast are not native to Ireland. Even if you're breeding Buckfast bees in Ireland, that's one thing, but that does not mean they're native. Even if they've been here for 100 years, they're still not native because Buckfast have been brought in very recently. They are not part of our understanding of what has been here for a long time. And we still don't know how well Buckfast actually does in Ireland. It's not a subspecies of bee anyway. It's an artificially created type of bee. So it's not natural and it's not native. Not natural in terms of it was assembled by Brother Adam after the apparent demise of native UK Apis mellifera mellifera. Originally, he crossed mellifera mellifera and Ligustica, but later he added other subspecies, and so it's not really clear. I guess it's never been characterized genetically, so it's not really clear what it is. Buckfast in Ireland, the ones we've sampled very few at the moment, and they seem to be Carnica and mellifera crosses. Well, because of what we're comparing them to, that's what they seem to be. So this table in the bottom shows you a proportional assignment of these 4 Buckfast to either the C lineage or Irish mellifera, and you see that they are around 50% similarity to the C lineage, and around just under 50% similarity to Irish mellifera. So in the book Fast in Ireland contains a reasonable amount of mellifera, and it seems to be Carnica rather than Ligustica. Other misinformation from beekeepers includes that honeybees are an endangered species on a global scale, and this is simply not true. Honeybees are everywhere, and they have colonized North America, and they're all over the world at the moment. It's true that there has been colony collapse. So the bees from managed beekeepers have suffered large collapses on a yearly basis due to disease and other impacts. But honeybees still exist. They're everywhere. So what are endangered are our native subspecies. So Apis mellifera is endangered across its range because it's actually been made extinct in some parts of its range and threatened in other parts. And other subspecies of honeybee are also extinct for this reason, because people are bringing in non-native bees and out competing and basically impacting on the native bees. Second one, I've never been able to justify killing a vigorous queen simply because she or her offspring are not aesthetically desirable. And this is also not true. This is not why people are advocating killing of queens. It's not due to aesthetics. It's not that black bees look better or are nicer to, just nicer to have. It's that they're native and that they are important in our biodiversity. So yes, I have killed hybrid queens because I am interested in conserving our native bee. And so I'm not killing her because of her color. I'm killing her in order to requeen the colony and try and have black bees. And I certainly don't want to disseminate non-native drones and genes into the population in an area where I know people are trying to maintain black bees. At the end of the day, the goal of any breeder, whether in Ireland, Germany, America, or anywhere else, should be first and foremost to produce bees that are docile, healthy, and productive. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, a breeder will choose what traits it wants in its bees, but actually in Ireland, there are very few bee breeders, true bee breeders. 95% of beekeepers in Ireland are hobbyist beekeepers and love their bees and are not really, haven't to date at least, gone to great lengths in order to breed very deeply. So again, just refer back to this idea that we have two kinds of bees in Ireland. We have bees that are maybe highly bred, highly managed by beekeepers. We have a whole host of the managed cohort are not highly bred either. And then we have wild bees. So the impacts on Irish honeybees I guess throughout its time here. One was the massive population crash in the 1920s with Isle of Wight disease, which was thought due to the acarine mite. So the top picture there shows the mite in the brachia of the bee. But actually it's thought that there were other, I guess, issues around that time that maybe made the influence of that disease much higher, in terms of people were busy after the war and so on. We've had a massive change in habitat, loss of habitat in recent years, and over the time of the bees colonizing Ireland, with very few trees and very few old trees. And so we have a lot of, I guess, new buildings and old buildings and so on. So there's just a very big change in habitat. Then we have this issue of hybridization between subspecies and hybrids, which has really dramatically impacted some subspecies of bees in Europe. And is starting to impact on bees in Ireland for sure, and impact beekeepers anyway that are trying to maintain pure subspecies. Introduced pests and diseases. This is probably the main reason why a lot of beekeepers even are not in favor of importing bees, is because this is what brought in Varroa, and this is what would bring in other diseases as well. And so this is something to watch. And then, of course, we have other factors that impact bees, like pesticides and the continued battle with the large multinational pesticide producers in terms of the impact, not just the lethal impact, but there's a lot more work being done now, particularly by, Dara Stanley and Jane Stout and in UCD and Trinity on the impacts of pesticides, sublethal impacts of pesticides on bees. They're primarily bumblebees, but they will be more broadly applicable as well. So impacts on their learning behavior and foraging and so on. So Apis mellifera mellifera, which is the bee native to Ireland, has gone a massive decline in recent years. So on the left-hand side, you see the picture of a distributional map of the original distribution of this subspecies in Northern Europe. And on the right, you see the map of current populations, protected populations of black bee. This was Gabrielle Salon's PhD thesis and the paper in 2009. And it shows very clearly that the huge demise of the population, and in some countries, the native bee, Apis mellifera mellifera, has effectively been made extinct. And in some cases, it's been protected by small populations of almost pure, in many cases, are being desperately protected. So this is the case in 2014, and there was no evidence, there was very little, there was some evidence about Irish bees, and it was assumed that Irish bees were extinct. And so a number of papers have been published since that time, including these in the bottom, which have focused on this. The first genotyping study really done that included Irish bees using microsatellites and mitochondrial DNA was Jensen et al. In 2005. And they had 48 bees from around the Galtee area, so Munster, South Leinster. And what this table shows is basically the differences, genetic similarity between bees in different populations. So along the top, you have Colonsay, Whitby, Sheffield. So these UK populations, Ireland, and then we have Danish and other populations. So what we show here is that basically the Irish bees are very similar to the Colonsay bees, 0.04, and also the English bees. So in this paper, they lumped the Irish bees with the English bees as a single population, but there was not very many bees and not a lot of data to make very clear conclusions. This paper published by a collaboration between us at NUIG and those in LIT, so Jack Hassett's and Keith Brown's PhD thesis, in collaboration with the Native Irish Honeybee Society, and also FIBCA contributed some funds towards genotyping. And so this research showed very clearly that we have a very significant population of pure Apis mellifera mellifera throughout the country. So this did focus of one half on bees that were from native Irish beekeepers and who thought that they had AMM, and this was to prove they did. And then we also included quite a large proportion of free living bees as an unbiased representation of the population. And both cohorts were at very, very high amount of genetic purity. And I'll talk about that in the next section about some of that analysis. So from here, I just want to summarize the bees that are in Ireland again. So basically from an origins perspective, we have bees here that are native to Ireland for two reasons. One, that they've colonized naturally and they've been here for about 8,000 years. And then bees brought over from the UK over 1,500 years ago that have also adapted and survived naturally here in Ireland. And the pictures and stuff are just various sources showing that these honeybees, Apis mellifera mellifera, have made their way into Irish culture. So they're in the place names like Clonmel, Milshawn. The Irish word for sweet comes from honey. Then we have lots of archaeological evidence and publications that include bees, honeybees in Ireland. And of course, we have the Brehon Law Academy here showing the bee judgments, which were a set of laws that were specifically for beekeeping in this country. And then in the last 100 years, we have bees being brought into Ireland, so non-native bees being brought into Ireland, including some more of Apis mellifera mellifera from other places, but at least that's the same subspecies. And then we have other bees that are brought in that are not the same subspecies and not native. So Carnica, Ligustica, and of course, Buckfast. And so this slide is just the references that I used in there. So in case you want to find them and do some more reading, you can do that. Okay, and so that's it for the second half of this lecture. And the third part will be about the molecular analysis of Irish bees. Okay, stop recording.